the name of God. Hello, everyone. We are here again with you with another episode of The Fact, the series that discuss international issues. Today we have three respected guests. We have Miss Bobana Andjelković from Serbia, and also Mr. Khaled Al-Kassimi from Canada, and also Mr. Gearóid Ó Colmáin from France. As you know, it has been few months that we have been witnessing a crisis in Venezuela, and we have two people claiming to be the president of the country. I would like to start with Mr. Khaled Al-Kassimi to know about the roots of this whole issue. And I would like to know about the roots in economic crisis in Venezuela that ended up in such a situation, and also the solution for that.
Oh, well, thank you for having me, Ali. I think for us to actually understand what's been going on in Venezuela, it's important for us to go back to the 80s. Well, more specifically for the last century, actually. Venezuela, before Chavez, Comandante Hugo Chavez took power in the 90s, there's been a systematic group of oligarchies, or we can call them a tragic westernized elite, or to be more specific, a petty bourgeois class, who have internalized the idea that there's only one model for development, which is a liberal capitalist modality of economics, but also, to be more specific, adopting the Washington Consensus as a doctrine for economic development. So if we go back to 1989, and this is a date that Venezuelans remember clearly, you had some of the biggest protests and movements which took over Caracas from February till March. And the main cause of this protest was the economic crisis, right? This idea that, privatizing specific economic sectors such as healthcare, education, the privatization of the oil industry. What these protesters were trying to highlight is that we need a change. There needs to be an alternative to this economic doctrine run by the Washington Consensus. So if we look at 1989 specifically, it's something that they call in Venezuela the Caracazo. And what's fascinating about that specific period is that the president Carlos Perez, before he got elected, he specifically said that the IMF is a neutron bomb, right? Now, the interesting part is that once he became president, he adopted all of the IMF policies that he supposedly was going to go against before his presidency. So, in general, what we have is an economic crisis in Venezuela that's been going on for the last century. It's only until Chavez came into power, the Chavismos, the Bolivarian Revolution, that the Venezuelan people started, most of the Venezuelan people started seeing a government that actually cares not simply for a specific oligarchical class, right, but actually for the general population, right? So I would say, in general, for us to find out the root cause of Venezuela's problem, we can't look at simply Juan Guaido. We can't simply look at President Nicolás Maduro. We need to look at history for the past 100 years. Venezuela is a bloated economic government, right? That's based on oil. So, and that's something that has systematically fractured the economy.
And about roots of economical crisis in Venezuela and what is the solution for that. Let's try to see things from backwards. In order to weaken and conquer Venezuela, Washington has to introduce the economic sanctions, and it has been doing it for years in many countries. Venezuela is a good example what sanctions are used when sanctions are used as a geopolitical weapon. We can maybe give ourselves freedom to discuss or maybe try to analyze internal problem of any country, its economy, its industry, or whatever. But we cannot discuss Venezuelan economic crisis without mentioning that Western colonial neo-Nazism is using legal and illegal weapons in order to enslave Venezuela and make it as a puppet, as they already did with many countries. We cannot have discussion about the real economical, political, or any kind of problems of some countries faces until it is not discussed on its own first. We have to listen what countries themselves say about what's happening internally. If the country faces external attacks from powerful enemy, I would say that all the problems come from external enemy, not internal problems, even if there are internal problems.
Okay, but there is a question in here. As you know, USA is claiming that Nicolas Maduro is trying to found a dictatorship in Venezuela.
Okay.
And so I would like to know if this whole thing is right. I mean, because this USA brought up this kind of coup in the country because of all this claim about Maduro. So do you think this whole thing is something correct or not?
Well, that's interesting because, if we look at Chile, for instance, in 1973, when the United States removed an elected democratic president such as Salvador Allende, they removed a democratically elected president and placed a dictator, right? Now, the interesting part is that it doesn't matter if you're a dictator or not, as long as you're our dictator, right? And that's a very interesting differentiation to make. The reason why the United States calls Maduro a dictator is because he is going against and following the trajectory that Comandante Hugo Chavez developed, right? He's continuing the Bolivarian dream of an alternative development model that's not strictly capitalist, right? But it's willing to navigate capitalism, socialism, right? Not simply be socialist or not simply be capitalist, right? And so, yes, he's a dictator in the eyes of Guaido and the families and the oligarchies who feel like the policies adopted by Bolivarian revolution will hinder their interests or what they've been exploiting for the past century, right? Now, for other parts of the Venezuelans, Maduro, he's elected. Like, he was elected in May of 2018 of last year, right? Over 6 million people voted for him. And what is fascinating is that the countries who are against Maduro, the Lima group, literally sent monitoring electoral groups to monitor the elections, and they've explicitly said that there was no fraud, right? The elections were fully authentic. There were no fraudulent activity. So it's interesting that the term dictator becomes used to undermine a specific individual or a government that is hindering or undermining a specific development model. And the reason why Maduro is labeled as a dictator is because his development model is trying to undermine the Washington Consensus and the free trade agreements that have been developed for the past 30, 40 years in the Latin American and Caribbean region, right? So a dictator becomes this word that tries to corner an individual, right, by saying that their policies are undemocratic, they violate humanitarian rights and require humanitarian intervention. But really, when a person looks deeper into why Maduro is being called a dictator, it's precisely because he's actually looking for the well-being of the whole Venezuelan population and not simply a specific class or a specific group of individuals, right? So that's why the term dictatorial becomes very prominent in policy circles or the United Nations Security Council, for instance. Elliot Abrams, John Bolton consistently said that Maduro is a dictator, even though he's elected. So I guess the Venezuelans elected a dictator, right? So it's obviously I'm joking.
That's the irony.
Yeah, or a tyrant, right? So I would say that's definitely a mischaracterization of and a last point, if it's possible, that I mention in relation to this.
Go ahead.
Because a part of the other part of your question was, is the United States right in claiming that, is Maduro correct in claiming that the U.S. brought a coup into the country? Now, what is interesting is that this is not the first time that the U.S. actually funds a coup in Venezuela. There has been a prominent coup in 2002. And I think for your viewers and your listeners, it's important to remember that Elliot Abrams and John Bolton, the individuals that were involved in starting the coup in 2002, are the same individuals right now who are involved in the coup and perpetuating it, right? So you literally have the same individuals who started a coup in 2002, which failed after 48 hours, precisely because it's the people who elected a Chavez. You know, the reason why a Chavez is important in Venezuela is precisely because most of the people felt like the economy is not supporting them. It's only supporting a specific strata of society. So it's important to remember that when Maduro says the United States is bringing a coup or is funding a coup, he's actually speaking to history. He's not saying that to get support. He's reminding international viewers and international listeners that Venezuela has been consistently been under attack by, the West, but also by, people from Venezuela, right? People who claim that Maduro is a dictator, but that's a small group of people who feel like their wealth and their interests are being undermined with the change that the Bolivarian Revolution wants to instigate and has been instigating.
About Nicolas Maduro's intentions to found a dictatorship, or is he right when he claims that USA brought a coup to his country? I would say that Maduro is following Chavez policies and politics, and he should be praised for that. He is not a powerful individual with charisma as Maduro was, but he is surely a Venezuelan patriot and responsible toward its people and country. Again, I would compare Chavez with Arafat and Maduro with Abbas. Maduro is right. US and English with Vatican behind it, the curtains, are responsible for whatever happens in Venezuela. And we Serbs, as we faced their rotten faces long time ago, we can say they shaped colored revolution, new style cups, and coups and silent occupation in Serbia. Otpor and Canvas were grassroots movements for all the colored revolution worldwide. People who are behind Otpor and Canvas in Serbia are really poor, frustrated individuals who suffer from complexes of either higher or lower values, and they're raised in immoral families who were always using the state assets during the false communism, or were soldiers of English and Vatican commander Tito, whose main task was to dissolve ancient Serbian state, kidnap its statehood and military and misuse it. I know that Tito is highly appreciated in many non-aligned countries, being socialist or not, but it is another big deception. As you may see these days, Maghreb countries are still ripped off by France, Libya is destroyed, the other parts of Africa suffer from covert Israeli, English and Yank occupation. Tito's heritage is more than evil. Serbia still pays off Tito's credits, but Croatia, Slovenia, Bosnia, Montenegro and Macedonia are not, although they ripped off Serbian countries as well.
Does anyone have any kind of estimation about the amount of popularity of, Guaido or Maduro in Venezuela? Or do you have any kind of estimation about that?
Well, that's a very good question. When we look at how Guaido got into power, we can see that he's not popular. Guaido was selected. He wasn't elected, right? Guaido was selected by the National Endowment of Democracy, USAID, the Atlas Network. Guaido, along other opposition members, such as the Capriles, the Ramos, they were implicated in the 2002 coup, but also more specifically the protests that occurred in Venezuela in the past 10 years. But the issue is that you're not popular if you're getting directions from external powers, right? In the sense that you're trying to create this artificial form of popularity, right? And to be quite frank with you, when we look at the demonstrations for Guaido, because there are people that want Guaido, let's not lie to ourselves, okay? But there are also people who want Maduro. Now, if we're looking at specific estimates, I can't give you empirical numbers because I'm not aware of them. But from the communications that I have with friends in Venezuela, they have explicitly told me individuals such as Greg Wolpert, individuals like Charlie Hardy, interviews with, let's say, Abby Martin, they've explicitly said that when you go to demonstrations of Guaido, what you see, one, they're very small in numbers, and two, and what I'm about to say, I don't want to be taken the wrong way, but you see a specific class of people in these demonstrations. So you see, the upper class of Venezuela being upset that, here you have Maduro trying to undermine Guaido. They want Guaido precisely because he protects their land, their private land that they've, accumulated for the past decades, right, through these economic policies, right? So, but if we look at the demonstrations for Comandante Maduro, what we realize is that there are people that are rich, poor, you have lawyers, engineers who are actually going to protest for Maduro. So from a sociological perspective, what we see is that the demonstrations for Guaido are actually a specific group of people in society that want him to be president. But when we look at Maduro, we see a cross class of people who actually want Maduro, not Maduro as an individual. They want the ideas of Maduro, of the Bolivarian Revolution, right? Because that's another fallacy that Western media seeks to proliferate, which is that Maduro, he's a dictator, similar with Bashar al-Assad, President Bashar al-Assad. Bashar is a dictator. But it's the ideas of President Bashar who are an enemy. It's the ideas of President Maduro who are perceived as, an enemy to the West, but also to a specific group of people in Venezuela. So,
Okay.
yes, sorry, go ahead.
Sure, actually, I just wanted to say that was truly, it explains a lot about the situation in Venezuela, and I'd like to thank you for all the explanation. Would you like to add anything to your comments?
If it's possible, yes. I just wanted to highlight something that's been perpetuated as well. A lot of people say that the reason why the United States wants to intervene is because of oil. That's not very accurate, because what we end up doing, if we just say it's for oil, what we're saying or what we're forgetting is that the ideas that the Venezuelans or the Bolivarian Revolution seeks to implement is the reason why the United States wants to intervene. It's not because of oil. Or to be more accurate, oil is a minimal reason, okay? Not to say that, it's not about oil, but, Venezuela is known for coltan as well, which is a very important natural resource, right? So if the US wants to go in for oil, they might as well go in for coltan as well. But it's precisely the Bolivarian Revolution of Simón Bolívar, Mariátegui, Sandino, Fidel Castro, all of these ideas, we can't forget Ernesto Che Guevara as well. So these ideas, which are still alive in Venezuela, are one of the reasons why the United States wants to intervene. And a final point, if possible, is in relation to the solution to this, right? This war on Venezuela has been going on since the 90s, specifically since Chavez took power. And again, it's because of the solutions that he provided. So to kind of quickly go over this, in 1994, there was a meeting between Chavez and Fidel Castro in Cuba, right? And that meeting happened the same week that a meeting was occurring in Miami to initiate the Free Trade Americas Agreement, the FTAA. Now, the meeting in Cuba was trying to highlight an alternative to capitalism, okay? While at the same time, there was a meeting happening in Cuba, which is saying we need to expand neoliberal policies. We need to make sure that there's people and governments in place that allow these policies to become implemented in Venezuelan economy. So the reason I'm saying this is because the intervention in Venezuela has not simply started in 2018. It's been going on. It's consistent in different ways, in different forms. Right. So one of the solutions that, was expanded by this revolution is something called La Alianza Bolivariana, right? Or the Bolivarian Alliance. And those are like transnational groups, solidarity groups, anti-imperial groups that seek to, raise consciousness about the Bolivarian Revolution and keep people aware of what's actually going on the ground, right? And not to believe terms like Venezuela is a socialist country or Venezuela is a communist country. Those are incorrect statements. Venezuela is a capitalist economy. It has groups of people such as the Bolivarian Revolution who want to regulate capitalism. They don't want to eliminate capitalism, right? They want to regulate it. They want to balance it, right? Because it seeks to highlight and prioritize a specific group of people over the rest, right? So all of this is just to say that Venezuela has been consistently under attack, right? And this is nothing new. Just a few hours ago, John Bolton announced that the United States wants to reactivate the Monroe Doctrine to deal with Venezuela. So I have high hopes for Venezuela. The people have a really high revolutionary consciousness. They're not individuals who are easily perturbed by outside meddling. And we can see this for the past 20 years. People have stood up for Maduro, have stood up for Chavez, and have stood up for the Bolivarian Revolution. And I think that's what we need to focus on, to keep, teaching ourselves about what this revolution is about, instead of, undermining it by simply saying, oh, well, it's a communist socialist program, so we don't want to talk about it.
If we have to compare who is more popular, either it is Guaido or Nicolas Maduro, I would say that there is an old Latin proverb which says, de gustibus non disputare. But Guaido really looks like an idiot, a brainwashed idiot. As long as we know that he was brainwashed by Canvas and Otpor in Serbia, I can surely tell you that he is an idiot. If we can take into consideration the fact that Serbian traitor organization Canvas was training him, he is beyond disgraceful and stupid. It is not possible to compare those two. Guaido is in a human shape. I do not even want to discuss more, because I think he is a just brainless moron and Western colonialism slave who would sell his own mother. And all my respects go to Maduro. If US is recognizing Juan Guaido as a president of Venezuela, it just says about USA's relationship to international law and their responsibilities toward the international community, which they want to misuse so much. Yanks never obeyed international law, as well as English and French, or less mentioned but very responsible Dutch. Somehow they always go off the radar but Dutch are very much responsible for the mess in the world, especially in the world of oil, and especially in the world of oil politics. Juan Guaido is a poor, deranged man who needs attention. English are very good in hunting this kind of poor people and make them their executive soldiers in accomplishing evil tasks around the globe. Yanks are just foot soldiers. They don't even have their own language. They took English. I would never give so much importance to the Yanks, although they are very aggressive. But I would just say that their power doesn't come from themselves. I would say that their power comes from English and Jews who run USA. And about the goals that US want to reach in this chaos. One of the goals which US always want to do is to rip off the local country, its resources, to overtake its already built infrastructure, to install the puppet governments which will fulfill all the sick plans of Yanks and their bosses in England, Vatican, and in IPEC, to enslave Venezuela, which is in the strategic part of the South America, and make it its own puppet, to extract the oil and other natural resources. And that would be it about American planning chaos in Venezuela.
Initial reason behind the crisis in Venezuela's presidency. Would you please explain about the root or the main reason that actually ended up in this kind of crisis?
I first visited Venezuela in 2010 and saw a lot of changes there in that time. I visited the new media outlets which were set up by the Venezuelan government at the time. Radio del Sur was one of the radio stations that had just been set up. These were essentially community radio stations that were very democratically run. They were very participative. I worked for them for a while, doing reports and research. I was very impressed with what I saw in terms of development in Caracas. I visited hospitals. I visited poor areas that had been basically redone completely with new buildings, new public buildings. I was able to visit a lot of these projects. I also visited some of the community projects that were happening there. For example, in the barrios of Caracas, the poor areas, they would regularly have meetings in the streets where they would discuss what they were going to do with government money. And I was able to attend some of those meetings and just see the level of popular democracy that was happening in the country, and it was really impressive. So there were an awful lot of good things that I saw in not just Caracas, but other parts of Venezuela. There were also a lot of problems. One of the big problems that they had in Venezuela at that time was trying to reform the police. So you had years of corruption due to failed neoliberal regimes, and you had a very corrupt police force. And that was a big problem. So not only had you a corrupt police force, but you had a huge homicide rate, which meant that going out in Caracas at nighttime was not advisable. So it was still quite a violent city, and the homicide rate was quite high. In fact, my group, we were actually attacked when we arrived there first. We were staying in quite a poor area, and our camera was stolen, and we were attacked with a knife. So it was a dangerous enough country even then, and that's not an easy thing to solve. but it's something they were working on, and it's kind of, I'd say, one of the failures of the Bolivarian Revolution is that they never really. It seems to me that they didn't really get control of the homicide problem in the country. When I was there, I stayed with a government official who was an advisor in the Foreign Affairs department. If I recall correctly, I think it was the Department of Foreign Affairs, and it was interesting because I stayed with a group of people from what basically it was a kind of a commune, and there were people from different countries in the world, and we were all there basically just to study what was going on, to meet and discuss what was going on, and to try and get a more accurate picture of the Bolivarian Revolution. I noticed that Chavez was very much interested in Peronismo, the justicialismo kind of regime that Perón had initiated in Argentina. That's what I was getting from a lot of the people I spoke to, that they were looking at Perón's social model as as a possible template maybe to study. And that was interesting because, Perón is seen as right-wing. I was surprised with that, but it was interesting when I asked people there about that. I mean, their attitude was, we're trying to solve real social problems. We're not looking at this theoretically. This is, we're looking at what works, and we're looking at poverty reduction, social housing, and also creating strong leadership. So I think that Chavez was a visionary in that respect. The alliances that Chavez formed internationally were creative, particularly the alliance with Gaddafi in Libya, but also with Lukashenko in Belarus. Chavez described the Belarusian system as a model, as a social model. And, what's interesting about that is that the social model in Belarus is not socialism. They don't call it socialism. They refer to it as a socially oriented economy. It's essentially a kind of a corporatist system, a national syndicalist type system is what I would describe it as. But if you look at, we'll say, compare Belarus to Venezuela, I think Belarus is better organized, and that partnership was very important. Lukashenko was very involved in encouraging Belarusian technical assistance, and it was one of those strategic partnerships which was a win-win. That seemed to decline with the arrival of Maduro after Chavez's death.
The initial reasons behind the crisis in the Venezuela presidency can be described by the last several US presidents, as well as their command in Vatican and London. And they were having been attacking Venezuela for a long time, a very long time. During the presidency of Hugo Chavez, Venezuela was always under the attack, and this is now just a continuing of the same thing. They maybe thought it would be easier with Maduro. I can compare this situation with Palestine. Chavez and Maduro are like Arafat and Abbas. It is more than obvious. It is about oil and other natural resources, but also about strategic positioning in the South America continent. Argentina and Brazil also got puppet presidents who do always do what London and DC say. Even Uruguay and Ecuador started to respond to London, DC and Vatican since Vatican and DC and London installed their people there. It is also more than obvious that this is not the original US policy. It is just an English style somehow redone. English are incestuous and very deranged nation which holds the world hostage by using narco-mafia, Nazism, and concentration camp and colored-level revolutions. London is the root of world evil, a part of Vatican. Their work is synchronized, and DC is just their hand across the Atlantic.
Thank you so very much. I would like also to know about the strengths and weaknesses of Nicolas Maduro's government in recent years.
And if we talk about strengths and weaknesses of Nicolas Maduro's government in recent years, personally I do not accept to see things through these concepts of strengths and weaknesses, because I think that those concepts of strength and weaknesses are the concepts taken from Western colonial style of marketing and liberal economy, which cannot be applied in Venezuela. We cannot talk in those terms if we want to see what is really going on. Since Venezuela is not Western style economy, we cannot talk about strengths and weaknesses in the way those concepts were defined by the West. We can only talk about its sovereignty and independence, which is disturbed, and about Venezuelan people and state, which are endangered by those who want to rip it off.
I would like to bring up the last question. I'd like to know about the things that anti-war and anti-imperialist groups can do concerning such events, and especially now about the chaos of Venezuela.
About anti-war and anti-imperialist group regarding in Venezuelan issue. In the forms and on the organizational level, they exist now. I really think that they can achieve nothing. If one has an armed enemy, the only way to fight is to be armed. There is not many ways. I think that the case of Gandhi and non-violent resistance against crooked English in India was not a rule. It was just a unique case which was not repeated any time again. There is no way to follow that example in reality today, and especially having in mind that American state and the US and UK and Israel are having soldiers who are paid, it means mercenaries, so we cannot ever think again about US Army. It's a mercenaries army. And more than half of century has passed since Gandhi did what he did, and there was not any similar case when non-violent movement got country back. And what happened to India after Gandhi? It is still under control by the English, and now even Zionist control. And their Prime Minister Modi is a very good example how English and Zionist puppet function. So Gandhi is not a rule, it is exception from the rule, and anti-imperialist and anti-war movement is oxymoron in its sense, its original sense. The only way to fight oppressors and conquerors is to fight back. In order to fight back, a country should have a sane and responsible and brave people to fight back and very organized army. Also, those people should be conscious about what they are doing it and for whom. In my humble opinion, the expression anti-war does not mean nothing. It is also the weapon of colonialism planted among people and nations in order to not do anything. It is a weapon, one of the tools of neuro-linguistic programming, which is also a psyop operation against people worldwide. There also has to be awareness about the misuse of language, which is one of the main weapons of Western colonialism. So the expression anti-war is planted by those who would even support anti-war movement just in order that their wars are won. That is why I give my deepest respect to Bashar al-Assad and his brave people and especially military. Venezuelan military should be ready and steady for the big war in order to win a small war. By the way, we all know that USA and UK, and especially Israel, do not have skilled infantry. If they are going to be brave, they can only do it from thousands of kilometers and from the air. Serbian military showed in 1991 what USA and NATO army is made of. That is why they hate us too much. Our small, comparing to NATO's small army, downed so-called invisible F-117, downed an AVAX, and so on. Not to mention the Shqiptar terrorists organization, which were the only infantry squad on the soil of Serbia that NATO could bring. But they were also Serbian citizens and traitors. They were too weak for our military, with many centuries of tradition and practice. And back to Venezuela for the end. The so-called anti-war and anti-imperialist groups can maybe do good propaganda for Venezuela, but that is all they are capable of. The main and most important things should be done by Venezuelan military and its people, and the countries which helping them, like China and Russia, who should be united and coordinated in order to expel the evil from their homeland of Venezuela. And it is the last time and really good time to show to US military that their own place is not on the top of military among the world, but they are just a terrorist organization, as Iran proclaimed them recently.
So much for your informative and fruitful words and comments. I'm really thankful to all of you, all three respected guests of this program, Ms. Andjelković, Mr. Colmáin, and also Mr. Kassimi. I hope we meet you again on the program in future episodes. And I'd like to put an end to this episode of the Fact series. But it is also worthy to note that our viewers and listeners can also follow our program and other discussions in our YouTube channel and website. So thank you everyone, and goodbye.